Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Hello, folks. Before we begin today, think to yourself, have you listened to something new lately? Because on the Simply Scary Podcast Network, there is always something new to try. Don't miss the latest episode of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights airing on Mondays. And of course, don't forget Horror Hill with Eric Peabody, Fear from the Heartland with Paul J. McSorley, and Drew Blood's Dark Tales. You can find them all at simplyscarypodcast.com, on YouTube, or your favorite podcasting service. Or be sure to visit the chillingtalesfordarknights.com website and become a patron and hear extended episodes from our vast audio archive. Join us for a while, won't you?
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Giving is a wonderful thing. Being able to share time, talents, and treasures with those around you is a feeling like nothing else. But unfortunately, if you never take a moment to reflect on your own needs and what helps get you motivated through the day, chances are you'll find yourself burnt out, unable to cope, and stretched too thin. If this is where you find yourself lately, what you need to do is look for a way to balance, to make sure you're taking care of yourself so when you help, you give, and you're the best you can possibly give. But if balance is lacking, and you're not able to cope like you used to, might I suggest that you try seeing someone who can help? And to that end, why not try BetterHelp? BetterHelp is online therapy that's here to help you find that balance. It's based around your schedule to be flexible, convenient, and a powerful way to get you where you need to be. Just answer a few questions and you'll be paired with a licensed therapist, and should the need arise, you can change therapists for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/horror today. 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/horror. Good evening. You're listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. Welcome, dear listeners, to Season 13, Episode 6. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and in this episode, I'll be performing 3 tales to terrify you, courtesy of author T.W. Grimm. Tonight, we'll hear stories of sadistic sailors, manufacturing mysteries, and backfiring breakthroughs. You're listening to the standard edition of tonight's program, which contains the first 2 spine-tingling stories. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy an extended version of this and other episodes with twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. Thank you for your support. Now, it's time to take a walk together down the moonlit trail. So lock your doors, turn your lights down low, and settle in. The show's about to begin. Settle down for a spell. Have a drink, a few snacks, and enjoy a tale worth telling. That's what I have in store for you next, as we hear of an unfortunate incident at sea, and of the madness that ensued. Without further ado, I present to you Adrift. Good Lord, surely the matter clock lies. It's after 3 in the morning? Is it really that late? This has proven to be an interesting evening, but I'm afraid I must soon make for my bed. The fireplace is burning low, my eyelids have grown heavy, and we've drained the bottle near to the dregs. There's just about enough to revive our glasses one last time, and so we shall. A toast, my good man, to all that is and to all that shall be. Oh, that single malt burns, doesn't it? It burns just like the fires that await us down below. The doctor has reproached me for drinking to excess on many occasions. He's even stated that it shall be the death of me, but I believe just the opposite. After a lifetime pursuit of all things arcane, the drink is likely the only thing keeping me alive. It holds the night terrors at bay, you see. It allows me to get some rest at night. What's that? I didn't quite catch the question. Oh, which one? That contraption sitting on the corner of my desk? Well, that's an old sextant. It's a device for nautical navigation. This one is very old, late 18th century. To this very day, one could probably still rely on it to find their way across the high seas. It was given to me by a family friend, a distinguished old naval captain named Theodore Burwell. Captain Burwell was a remarkable character, a stout, weathered little bear of a man, a decorated officer who spent most of his career maintaining order down in the Pacific Station. He was larger than life, Teddy was. He loved whores and he loved to drink, so we got along famously once I came of age and discovered that I, too, shared his enthusiasm for intoxicants and prostitutes. We'd spent many evenings together in cat houses around the world, sampling the various delights one can find in such places. Oh, right, of course, the sexton. I got sidetracked. It happens more frequently these days now that I'm in my twilight years. It's a curio that comes with a story, as they often do, but this one is quite ghastly, I'm afraid. Do you wish to hear it? I knew that you would. On the night that the sextant passed into my possession, Captain Burwell and I had consumed almost 60 ounces of rum on this back terrace, and we were both deep into our cups. His house was a massive structure that rested on the edge of a rocky cliff, and the terrace overlooked a placid tropical bay. It was a grand place to while away a summer's eve and drink to the health of the sea, as Teddy was fond of saying. The tone of the evening's conversation slowly veered from urbane and polite at dinner to one of rollicking, bawdy good cheer by 11. We boasted of the women we had lain with and recounted glorious tales of drunken public house brawls. The captain played a few old warbling sea shanty records at top volume, and we waltzed with patio furniture as our partners, only to curse them when the dance was over and hurl them into the bay. At one point, we actually got into a food fight with a passing troop of monkeys. Our drunken guffaws sounded no different than the enraged screeching of the primates, I've no doubt. One rude little fellow jumped up on the balustrade and began to pleasure himself in our direction. And I'll be damned if old Teddy didn't drop his trousers and give the monkey a dose of his own medicine. As the hour slipped into the single digits, however, Our mood gradually sobered, and the laughter dried up into silence. The old man set about trying to load his tobacco pipe with palsied fingers, while I stared up at the stars and wondered if anything might be staring back. Teddy snorted at me and said, "All the youth these days, with their heads out in space. Cast your gaze out across that bay if it's mystery that you're looking for. I can personally attest that there are many wondrous sights out there, and there are horrors, too. Horrors from beyond the human imagination." My interest was piqued, and I asked him if he'd care to elaborate. Teddy tried to light his pipe and, in the process, spilled tobacco all over his waistcoat. He cursed and slapped it away. "I witnessed many strange events during those years at sea, and I heard men speak of things even stranger. There's one incident in particular that still haunts me today, 40 years later. As I said to you already, lad, there are horrors out there." After some determined prying, the story poured from his mouth in a rush, and as I listened, my jaw dropped to the table. Early one morning, a few of Teddy's men had spied a sizable lifeboat bobbing adrift in the sea. Captain Burwell launched a rowboat to investigate the matter, and the men soon overtook the directionless craft and boarded it. They returned with a hollow-eyed, emaciated wreck of a man, the sole survivor of a devastating shipwreck. His only possessions were the sextant that currently resides on my desk, a long-bladed knife, and the ragged clothes on his back. The rescued man told them his name was William McCaster, and that he was ravenous and dying of thirst. Burwell ordered the ship's cook to pour him a bowl of corned beef broth, which he drank with trembling hands. After he drunk his fill of the broth, the ship's doctor came and washed the crusted sea salt out of William's open sores. The castaway was in terrible condition. He'd been burnt almost black by the tropical sun. His body was skeletal, and his movements were palsied. The doctor asked him if he knew how long he'd been adrift. After some deliberation, the wretched fellow answered, 3 months, I think. Probably more. The doctor proclaimed that the man was suffering from the effects of prolonged exposure to the blistering South Pacific sun, but otherwise was fit for questioning. He and Captain Burwell sat with William in private, and they listened to his story in an open-mouthed state of mounting horror and disgust. The castaway claimed to have been a crewman on a small fishing boat. A miscalculation by the ship's navigators saw them run aground on a hidden reef with devastating consequences. Miraculously, every man aboard the sinking ship managed to make it to the lifeboat, 17 in total, but the provisions on board proved to be woefully inadequate. Even with stringent rationings, every morsel was gone within a week. Enough rain fell to keep the men's thirst at bay, but their attempts to harvest nourishment from the sea were largely unsuccessful. Famine seized the lifeboat with skeletal fingers, and the men starved in its grasp. It wasn't long before the fishing boat's captain gave in to the madness of hunger. In the dead of night, his mind snapped, and he arose to creep stealthily amongst the sleeping forms of his exhausted crew, his knife and his teeth both bared to kill. He fell upon the weakest of them, and the man's sharp cries quickly roused the others from their shallow and troubled slumber. Horrified, the other men hastened to interrupt the murderous assault, but were driven back by wild strikes from their captain's knife. Most of the would-be rescuers were badly injured by his steel, 2 of them grievously so. The other crewmen now huddled together as far away as possible. The captain finished his prey by sinking his decaying teeth into the poor bastard's neck. William told his interrogators that he'd observed his fiend slurp up the dying man's blood until he became so engorged he vomited a vast wave of red all over the bottom of the boat. The fishing captain stayed with his grisly banquet day and night until the corpse was nothing but a rotten stick-man of chewed gristle and splintered bone. The rest of the lot could only look on in revolted horror, as the lunatic bent to his feast, crossing themselves and praying for deliverance. The captain had lost all semblance of humanity. The man had degenerated into a mute, wild-eyed savage, caked with a thick layer of dried blood and surrounded by a cloud of flies. He began to urinate and defecate in the lifeboat rather than over the side, and his men suffered from infections. Several of them died and were given a hasty burial at sea by their mates before their captain had the opportunity to steal the corpses. When the madman's ghastly banquet had become too rotten and spare to consume any longer, he finally threw it overboard, and then he turned his burning gaze to the remaining crewmen, naked hunger in his eyes. The men decided to sleep in shifts, but it was to no avail. That very night a thick fog descended on them. Under its cover, the lunatic slithered over the crewman's side of the boat on his stomach, slowly, like a serpent. One of the men, who had been badly injured during the first attack, was set upon and dragged up by his foot. After winning a grim match of tug-of-war with the others, the captain dragged him to the stern of the lifeboat, and, grinning at the pleas for mercy from his crew, he cut the man's throat. After the second man's body was consumed, the ravenous monster stole another crewman, and then another. Days of tension blended into nights of terror, and the castaways grew steadily weaker from hunger and psychological pressure. The ghoul in their midst, however, only grew stronger. Soon, their captain became too strong for the others to fend off, even as a group. At that point in time, he ceased the practice of waiting for his men to lose their fight against sleep and begin the attack at them as will. Much to their misery, the captain made a grisly discovery. Instead of killing a man and then hastening to consume as much of his flesh as possible before it spoiled, he could simply cut or chew off a few mouthfuls of living meat as the need arose. Chunk by bloody chunk, he whittled the anguished castaways down until many of them were little more than armless, legless stumps. If a man died, the fiend would concentrate his appetites on the body until it squirmed with maggots. The scavenging seabirds began to wheel overhead in such numbers that they blocked out the sun. Eventually, the only people left were William and his captain. At this point in the man's narrative, Teddy and the doctor glanced at one another, and Teddy asked, "How in God's name did you manage to escape the fate of your crewmates? Why are you still alive?" His voice little more than a rusty croak, William answered that he'd somehow caught his boogeyman unawares, and in an act of sheer desperation, he rushed at him and pushed the madman overboard. He kept his captain from hauling himself back into the boat by relentlessly slicing at the man's hands and arms with his own knife. Eventually, the waves and current pushed the boat away from its exhausted pursuer, and William lost sight of his flailing captain. He presumed the captain to be dead from either shark attack or drowning. When pressed on how he had avoided being maimed by their captain during his lunatic fits of cannibalism, William fell silent. Teddy pressured him to answer, and finally he mumbled, "Through cowardice. When the others tried in vain to fight him off, I always hid behind them. I couldn't face him. I was too afraid." Captain Burwell saw to it that the traumatized man received the best care that he could muster and made haste for the nearest port. Night fell. Shortly after the moon set, the night's gentle silence was broken by a clanging alarm. Everyone rushed to the deck only to discover that the rowboat was missing and the sentries were dead. They'd been stripped of their weapons and most of their flesh. The castaway was no longer on board. Poor Teddy was devastated that he'd been so adeptly fooled by the monstrous fiend. He swore an oath to the murdered sentries that he'd personally see the degenerated bastard stand before a firing squad. He sought any and all records pertaining to the castaway's missing ship and confirmed what he already knew to be the truth. William had not been a crewman on the lost fishing boat. He had been her captain. I asked Teddy if the madman had ever been found and apprehended, and he slowly shook his head while staring out at the bay. I never found him, nor did anyone else. As far as I know, he's still out there drifting without destination, and settling upon anyone foolhardy enough to bring him aboard. He paused, then said, "When I retired from the service, I was embittered by my failure to bring the fiend to justice, but I was glad for it, too, because the thought of facing him again made a cold sweat seep from my brow. William McCaster was no longer a man. He was a monster, and monsters never die easily." He lapsed into silence after that, and we both began to yawn. Teddy begged my pardon and announced that he intended to retire for the evening. I followed the old man into his study, where he paused to present me with an impulsive gift, the cannibal sextant. I left with the thing clutched in my hands that were quivering with a raw, visceral excitement, a newfound thirst for the macabre that gradually became an obsession. My burning desire to seek out the unexplained had led me to the ends of the earth, and even further, much, much further. Indeed, there are many wonders in this world, but there are also horrors. Say now, would you like to have it? The sextant, that is. Now, go on, take it with you. I insist. I have many such objects in my collections, and I have no uncontested heirs to receive them when I pass. Take it, please. At the very least, it shall make for an interesting conversation piece. Life is too brief for dull conversations. Well, I should be off to bed. Thank you for sharing this evening of chills and intrigue. I do hope that you come back soon. Some tales are best shared after the sun sinks past the horizon, along with a bottle of strong drink and a comfortable blaze crackling in the fireplace. Don't you think so? Have a safe voyage, sleep well, and take a bit of advice with you from a man who knows well of such things. Remember to take care when stepping out into the twilight. The transition from light to dark can be an uneven one. People have been known to stumble and fall. Good night. We shall visit again soon, I'm sure. I'll look forward to it. I hope you enjoyed Adrift by T.W. Grimm as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented feature author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Grimm. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/GRIM. If you can't get enough of what you hear tonight, then I have good news. His previously self-published works are going to be made available through Velox Books this year. Be sure to catch the first release, Tripping Over Twilight, which will be released July 21st in Kindle format. That's Tripping Over Twilight, with more volumes to come. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Do you ever find yourself doing things to help others while your own tasks slide further and further behind schedule? It's great to be helpful, and that has its own rewards. But leaving yourself behind does you no favors either. You begin being weighed down with obligations, responsibilities, things you don't even remember you need to do, and pretty soon you can find yourself burnt out, stretched thin, and certainly not the you want to show the world. The best solution is to find balance, to make sure you aren't neglecting yourself while still able to accomplish great things. But finding someone to get you that balance isn't always easy. If you need a little help finding your balance, might I recommend BetterHelp. BetterHelp is online therapy that's there to help you when you need to remind yourself to get to your best self, to keep yourself from falling into traps and getting the balance you need to Face each day with your best self. It's convenient, flexible, and designed to fit your schedule, no matter how busy. Just answer a few simple questions and you'll be paired with a licensed therapist who will be ready to give you the balance you need. But if you feel like things aren't working out, you may change your therapist at any time for no charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/horror today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp. HELP.com/horror. A tale told by me, of a fellow telling a tale to a friend over drinks, who enjoyed drinks with a captain who told him a tale, who relayed a tale told to him by a ghoulish murderer. Quite a matryoshka doll of tales, wouldn't you say? Let's just hope the deeper we go, the more fictional the stories get. Does our original teller have more in store for us, though? It would appear so, as we return yet again to an after-midnight visit where we will be regaled with a much more personal story, one of treachery, dark dealings, and the dangers of unfettered corruption. And that's just the first few minutes. Without further ado, I present to you the Burmese incident. Here you are, old friend. One more glass of claret each, and we've drained the bottle dry. Imagine, will you, what might have happened if the phylloxera louse had succeeded in destroying the Bordeaux vineyards entirely. I may have spent far fewer mornings in the grip of a sourgut hangover, that's what. The hand hour on the grandfather clock has slipped past 1, I see. Time for one more tale, and then I'm afraid I must retire. I'm not a young man anymore, and neither are you, sir. I can hear our beds calling to us. As a betting man, I'd wager your driver is probably sleeping quite soundly behind the wheel of the Bentley as we speak, the drunken old beggar. Truth be told, I'm really quite envious of those who sleep soundly. Without the drink, I rather doubt I'd never sleep at all. When I close my eyes, memories have a tendency to invade my dreams and corrupt them into the most horrid nightmares. Speaking of which, tell me something, if you will. Have you ever traveled to the Southeast Asian nation of Myanmar? I have, although it was many years ago. At that time it was still known as Burma. It was a journey I shall never ever forget. You see, at the end of the Second Great War, my father took an interest in the possibility of acquiring land in Burma with the intent of developing it for industry. Father was also a betting man, and he was wagering that certain entities in Burma would gladly welcome the strength and status which could only be acquired by obtaining a steady flow of foreign currency. My father was an industrialist, a man with a very long reach, who was quite short on empathy. The canny old buzzard knew that Southeast Asia had been beaten into submission by the ravages of war. He believed it would soon be ripe for exploitation and plunder. In the wake of the devastation which was wrought upon the land by Nazi and Allied forces alike, the entirety of Asia was being groomed for the industry of manufacturing. Burma, in particular, had received a terrible battering during the fighting between the Allies and the Japanese. When the people who had been displaced by the conflict were finally able to return to their homes, they often discovered their landscape and the surrounding countryside had become a dystopian horror in their absence. The once fertile landscape was marred by crusted patches of tortured earth, devastated by heavy machinery, and scarred by the craters of artillery bombardment. With their livelihood pummeled into non-existence by years of constant warfare, the people found themselves in dire need of a new way to earn a living. As soon as the dust had safely settled in the wake of the war, industrialists and investment groups began to embark upon diplomatic visits into the region. They were eager for the chance to set up shop and offer the peasants the dubious opportunity to earn a pittance in return for hard labor in their factories. The old man was slavering at the opportunities which might have lain within such an economically depressed situation, but he cautiously waited to observe how this venture might unfold for his peers and rivals. He was uncharitable and hard of heart, my father, but he was certainly no fool. The transition from self-sustaining agriculture to assembly line servitude was a difficult one. Despite the many years of uncertainty and strife that they'd been made to suffer throughout the war, the Burmans remained a proud and quietly defiant people. They were vocal with their complaints and were prone to civil disobedience. In the meantime, money was being made hand over fist in Japan, India, and Bangladesh, and without all the resistance and general bother. My father decided to purchase mining options in India instead, and he bided his time. It came to pass that the event which my father had deemed inevitable finally occurred. A military coup was staged in Burma, and Prime Minister Nu was deposed by his usurpers. Before long, it became clear that Burma's new dictatorship was not as keen on serving the people's needs as they'd been led to believe. Political sanctions left the country in a state of financial vulnerability. They were in dire need of friends with deep pockets, and my father possessed very, very deep pockets. However, something the old goat was short on was time. My father was an exceedingly busy man, and as his oldest son, I was often elected to represent him in business matters that would have seen him traveling abroad. He was loath to embark upon any journey that would result in being surrounded by more brown faces than white. Indeed, my family's patriarch was a ruthless, clever, iron-willed horse's ass of a human being, criminally prejudiced in both thought and deed. He saw no wrong in his actions because the concept of right and wrong simply did not exist for the man. If he could see a way in which his fortunes might be expanded, the only question was whether or not he could succeed in the enterprise. He didn't give the slightest damn at all for the well-being of others, and I can assure you this is a depressingly common trait in men of his financial stature. Of course, as wealthy as we both are, it would be impossible to lay claim to a clear conscience. I've made many callous decisions to generate vast profits for myself, whilst knowing full well the result of these decisions might ultimately lay waste to the lives of many others. I've done this, and so have you. Don't deny it. However, there is a fundamental difference between men such as ourselves and men like my father. If you were handed a loaded shotgun and were offered a large sum of money to pull the trigger on me, your oldest and dearest friend, I'm sure you would outright refuse to do so. I'm of the same bent. However outrageously high the amount might be, I would be morally unable to carry out with the act. Now, the old man, it would merely be a question of mathematics. Could he buy his way out of any potential consequences, and if so, how much of the proffered money would be left after the expense of his legal defense? If he deemed the sum large enough to be worth the risk, I'd surely end my existence as a fine spray of red on the wall behind my chair, and be damned if I was his son and heir. Do you know what is truly frightening? Those who have been cut from the same moral cloth as my father own the entire world, my good man. They own it and everything that dares to reside upon its surface. But I'm wandering off topic, aren't I? I was telling you about the Burmese incident. So, it came to pass that in June of 1964, my father called me into his office to inform me that I was to pack my bags and travel to Burma post-haste. He assigned me the task of wooing the appropriate officials into allowing our estate to acquire and zone quantities of land for industrial use. After several days of grueling travel, I arrived at my destination only to find that post-war Myanmar was in an abysmal state of oppression and destitution. Many former landowners had been reduced to a state of ragged, nomadic begging. It was the most squalid situation I've ever personally witnessed, and I've been to many dark places, old friend. Many. I entered the country through Manipur, leaving Imphal early in the morning. I was driven in a rattling heap of a truck by an ancient-looking and taciturn Indian man. Throughout the entire voyage, he spoke not a single word to me, and he smoked an astonishing amount of hashish in a hand-carved wooden pipe. With the look of amused disdain, he would periodically push the sticky object into my hands, and I gratefully inhaled to starve off my discomfort and boredom. The hashish was layered with veins of the most potent opium I've ever encountered. I don't think I could really tell you much of what took place on that long drive from Manipur to Mandalay, save that, despite the poor quality of the roads, I felt as if I were floating upon the back of God's own sacred stallion. I was probably grinning like a fool for the duration of the journey. However, I wasn't so stoned that I don't remember how frequently we stopped at various checkpoints, to be held at gunpoint and barked at by Burman men in tattered military uniform. A driver would hand them a few bills from the stack of rupees which had been demanded of me by the old Indian's nephew back in Imphal City, and then we would be waved along. I was probably very close to death at any number of these checkpoint stops, but I could not sense this danger through the dreamy haze the narcotics had draped over my senses. This, I imagine, was probably for the best. And then, as if rudely awoken from a golden dream, I suddenly found myself in the pulsing heart of Mandalay. The truck was no longer moving, and I was being pulled unceremoniously from my seat by my driver, who appeared to have become quite irate at my unresponsive state of drug-induced stupor. He eloquently cursed my very existence and tossed me to the ground. My luggage quickly followed. I heard a cacophony of angry shouting, and a small group of Burman men set upon the driver before he could flee to the safety of his truck. They dragged him to the other side of the road and proceeded to administer a sound beating. As the weeping man was being kicked, slapped, and ultimately thrown into the muck that flowed along the bottom of the gutter, another Burman man knelt beside me and helped me to my feet. He said, "I'm so sorry for this outrage, sir. My deepest apologies. He's being dealt with accordingly, as you can see. The man is an addict and a scoundrel, hardly better than a dog, but he has his uses." While almost everyone else was clothed in traditional Burman sarongs, my distinguished new acquaintance was wearing a Western-style suit and sported a Western hairstyle. He steadied me with one hand as he brushed me off and then clasped my hand in a firm handshake. He said, "My name is Bo Kwang Ki. You can simply call me Kwang Ki if you wish. Welcome to Burma, sir. I fear you look rather tired, but we must be leaving for our destination at once. There is an urgent matter there which demands my attention immediately." Bo Kwang Ki escorted me down the street to a waiting limousine. I was still quite groggy from the opium-laced hashish, and the commotion of life in Mandalay was almost overwhelming. Everywhere I looked, there were restless throngs of humanity bustling to and fro, thousands of people engaged in thousands of errands. Despite the economic hardships that were soon to come, there was still a multitude of vendors selling spices, linen, livestock, any product or service you could possibly imagine. There were performers and prostitutes, laborers and housewives, holy men, beggars, every ethnicity and nationality that existed beneath the sun. Motor vehicles rolled down the street behind donkey carts, all of them piled to precarious heights with goods of every description. If one were either brave or foolish enough to wander through the alleys, they would find layabouts, thieves, and cutthroats from all corners of creation. Any face that passed by on the street could belong to a member of the secret police. It was an unstable time, and just about anyone could be an informant, a double agent, or just another murderer for hire. Even in the company of my new business acquaintance and savior, I could easily say the wrong thing and find myself in mortal peril. The prefix Bo is an honorific in Burmese culture, which translates to something like commander or general. I would be far from safe within the confines of the luxury limousine. In fact, to get inside any vehicle with a commanding officer at the present military regime was akin to crawling into the belly of the beast. Once inside, I might never be seen again. Once we were safely ensconced within the sumptuous comforts of the limousine, Kyung Ki commanded the driver to take us to Facility A. As the driver navigated the enormous vehicle through the crowded streets, I was informed the new regime's official stance was to favor agrarian peasant culture over Western-style industrialization. However, they were secretly quite interested in the mass production of arms, ammunition, and armored vehicles with a military purpose. According to my host, my father had already purchased land and built a factory for the development and construction of a lightweight metal alloy, a miracle metal that was stronger than steel. I had no idea any such arrangement was already in place. Kwang Ki saw the confusion on my face and handed me an envelope. He said, "This will answer all of your questions," and pushed the envelope into my hands. I wasn't surprised to see it had already been opened, presumably by Bo Kwang Ki himself. There was a letter from my father inside. It had been dated and mailed almost a week before my hasty departure. I believe I still have it somewhere. Yes, in this old chest. Just a minute. Yeah, here it is. Look here. The selfish old goat had written the following. I'm afraid I did not tell you the full story behind the reason for your visit to the region of Mandalay. I confess I have already financed a manufacturing facility in the area, with another soon to be under construction. I've been receiving conflicting and, I dare say, sensationalistic reports of extremely violent civil unrest in the nearby village. It's been suggested by a few of my scientific advisors that some byproduct of the manufacturing process may be responsible for this antisocial behavior. With this dire possibility in mind, I need someone who's a trusted member of the family to sort out the situation in a timely and discreet manner. You're a capable man in your own right, and also my very own flesh and blood. This is a very sensitive matter. You must dig to the bottom of this mess and report back to me at once. My apologies for committing the sin of omission, but frankly, I believe you may very well have refused to go if I'd been forthcoming with all of the details. By all reports, you're walking into a very dangerous state of affairs. Trust Bo Kwang Ki and no one else. He claims to no longer have faith in the current regime and is now in my employ. He will act as both your guide and your bodyguard throughout the duration of your investigation. He too is a capable man. If things become too dangerous, he will ensure your prompt and secure exit from the country. Rest assured. Serve us well, my son, and take care to stop this embarrassment from reaching neither the ears of our enemies nor those of the media. Our very livelihoods may depend upon it. Yours truly, Father. As you can see, the absolute scoundrel couldn't even be bothered to sign off with his given name. Just, yours truly, Father, and nothing more. I glared over at the stranger to whom I was expected to entrust my very life, and I roared, "What in blazes is happening here? I demand to know at once." He chuckled dryly at my outburst and said, "It would be better if I were to show you, sir. You won't believe it until you've seen it for yourself." We drove in silence for the better part of an hour, long enough for me to sober up and regain my wits. The facility was located near the bank of a river southeast of Mandalay. It was surrounded by an enormous stone wall, a forbidding behemoth, that was topped by hundreds of spools of razor wire. We were ushered through a massive iron-wrought gate by armed security, and we drove for nearly a quarter of a mile along a dirt laneway until the main building rose into view. We passed 2 more checkpoints on the way, each accompanied by a perimeter of electrified fencing. I was both impressed with and deeply troubled by the stringency of their security. I gestured at the fencing and demanded, "Pray tell, sir, what in God's name goes on in this place that would require such measures?" Guang Qi offered an enigmatic smile. He said, "These precautions are a relatively new development. Be patient for just a few more minutes, and then it will all become very clear to you." The limousine stopped at the rear of the main building, and I was hustled through a fire exit and down a long, sterile-looking corridor. Guang Qi stopped in front of a sturdy-looking metal door that was flanked on either side by 2 armed soldiers, and he said, "Take this, sir, and brace yourself for what you're about to witness." He pulled a .38 pistol from a hidden pocket in his jacket and pushed it into my hand. His expression was drawn and tense. It was clear that he was very afraid of whatever waited for us on the other side of the door. The tough old career officer steadied himself and uttered a quick prayer before pulling back several large deadbolts. After taking in a very deep breath, he nodded to me and threw open the door. A horrid stench of putrefaction rushed out to assail my nostrils, causing me to gag in revulsion. Guang Qi pressed his handkerchief over his face, as did I, and we crossed the threshold into the very bowels of hell. The interior of the room was made of highly polished concrete. There were several drains on the floor, and a number of new water hose reels were affixed to the walls. There were 8 man-sized cages bolted to the floor, and 3 of them were occupied by the most ghastly-looking wretches I'd ever laid eyes on. They all wore filthy clothing and possessed the gray, mottled appearance of a corpse. They began to hurl themselves against the bars of their protective cages as we entered the room. They made no sound at all, these creatures. They simply stared at us with a fierce expression of open-mouthed idiocy, and they battered themselves with great force against the steel bars of their prisons. All 3 of them were caked in dried gore, adding to the already abominable odor in the room. "God in heaven," I choked. "What in the name of Jehovah is wrong with these people?" Guang Qi gave me an appraising look and said, "They're dead, sir. They have no pulse, brain activity, or autonomic reflexes. They're actively decaying before our very eyes." I growled, "Balderdash, they could not be possibly deceased. They're moving under their own power." Bo Guang Qi uttered a cynical laugh and snapped, "I've seen many dead men in my days on this planet, sir. Seen the man made them, and I tell you, these people are dead as dead can be." I was both horrified and completely transfixed by the mindless violence with which they threw themselves against the bars. "What do they want from us?" I asked. "It seems they would be very much liking to attack us." "They want to eat us alive," Guang Qi said, and he nodded at the shocked expression on my face. "Oh yes, I'm telling you the truth. If they could, they would leap upon us like starving leopards and bite chunks of living flesh from our bodies. This one here, do you see the blood around his mouth?" He explained that the awful thing had been discovered in the act of devouring a small child in a field just outside of Wide River, a village not far from the grounds of the facilities. They'd been forced to evacuate the village after this last attack, the latest in a series of more than 20 such incidents in the 3 weeks preceding my arrival. They could no longer keep the situation a secret without removing and isolating the villagers. I choked out, "I've seen enough. Let me out." When the door was safely locked up tight behind us, Guang Qi continued my debriefing. He said, "I apologize for that, but I felt you'd need to see the effects of this disaster for yourself before I could tell you the full story. May I have the firearm back, please?" The company had been storing some of the waste products of the process in an underground storage bunker. Some bungling fool decided to dig this bunker upslope from the village. Several barrels of some toxic compound leaked into the bare earthen floor during a rainstorm, of course. Several weeks later, the body of a recently deceased farmer staggered into the village, covered from head to toe in the muck of the grave. It immediately attacked several people, tearing at them with its teeth as they screamed in horror. A brave villager dealt it a number of grievous blows with an axe, but it continued to come for him until the villager planted the head of the axe deep into the horrible thing's skull. All those who were bitten during the farmer's cannibalistic frenzy died within the hour, only to rise again with blank eyes and savage teeth. 10 more were injured that night, and one woman was killed outright during the attack. A witness stated that as the woman's last breath gurgled from her chest, the fiend immediately lost interest and pursued the witness instead. The dead woman rose from the ground within 60 seconds, lurching outside to add to the bloodshed and terror in the streets of the village. The infection spread like wildfire, resulting in a state of utter chaos. A military unit stationed nearby came to the village in armored vehicles and made short work of the marauding creatures. All the wounded were taken for observation and were ultimately destroyed before the hand struck the midnight hour. The soldier was bitten on the hand by one of the afflicted, and he was also transformed, injuring several others before the whole lot of them were unceremoniously turned into mincemeat under the attack of a blazing gun of the commanding officer. After this initial wave of infection, there were no further incidents for almost a week, when an old woman succumbed to a natural death in her slumber. Her corpse came lurching out of her home and attacked a passing villager, sparking off another round of shootings by the soldiers, who had been left behind to monitor the situation. It became clear that anyone living within the village and the surrounding countryside had already been thoroughly contaminated by the offending toxin, and death from any cause was sure to spark another outbreak. Needless to say, I was appalled beyond words. I shook my finger and sputtered, "Why don't you put the horrible wretches out of their misery, for God's sakes? What purpose is there in keeping them in that room for even 1 second longer?" Quang Ki explained the dreadful things were of great scientific interest to the regime. He laughed and added, "Do you really believe your own government would dispose of such a curious anomaly, sir? I think not. They would do exactly as we're doing, as would any nation." I rounded on him and sputtered, "My God, man, have you lost your mind? By the power invested in me by my father, I declare this facility will be shut down immediately. The construction of the other plant shall also be halted. How has this not already happened, for Christ's sakes?" Bo Quang Ki offered me a razor-sharp smile and said, "You do not understand, sir. It was your own father who refused to shut down. He insisted that he first be allowed to send an emissary of his choosing to assess the situation, then give him a first-hand report on the matter." I was dismayed, but not at all surprised. My father loved money before all else in this world. He would sacrifice his own flesh and blood before he'd spurn even one singular day's worth of revenue from one of his numerous ventures. I demanded access to a telephone and called him at once. Father expressed grave consternation at the events which had transpired in the village. He reluctantly agreed to shut the facility down until his scientists for hire were able to gain some insight into this grisly phenomenon. I announced I would be leaving first thing in the morning and flatly declined Father's insistent requests that I stay until the matter was resolved. I was almost as sickened by his greed as I was by the caged monstrosities that lay behind the steel door. I dare say they were, for all intents and purposes, one and the same. I was taken to an area filled with canvas tents, an outdoor ghetto to house the laborers who worked on the factory floor. I was given a tent furnished with a cot and nothing more, and and I purchased food and drink from a woman who patrolled the impromptu campgrounds with a hand-woven basket filled with refreshments. I spent the evening speaking at length with Bo Kwang Ki concerning the finer details of the plant's imminent closure. He was afraid the workers would riot if they were told to summarily pack their belongings and go home. I assured him I would finance their wages out of my own pockets in the weeks to come if it came to that. I was determined to keep everyone exactly where they were until more was known about the toxic byproducts and their effects on both the living and the deceased. If the workers had become contaminated by drinking groundwater from their communal well, they couldn't possibly be allowed to leave the premises. Such a foolish decision would surely start a horrific chain reaction, one that could lay waste to the entire country, and beyond, I'd imagine, far beyond. Throughout our negotiations, I noticed Kwang Ki was subtly attempting to sway me into allowing the plant to continue production, extolling the virtues of their miracle metal and its many benign applications. He expressed concern regarding the possibility of scandalizing the regime on the world stage. I stoically ignored his requests and implied threats, but on the inside, I was sweating bullets. I could see the writing on the wall, and it boded poorly for my own well-being. I wished Kwang Ki a good night, and spent long hours lying awake in my cot, waiting for the residents of the squalid encampment to settle down and retire to their beds. I feared Bo Kwang Ki was not actually my bodyguard and advisor, so much as he was my jailer and eventually my executioner. He may have been in my father's pocket, but his allegiance lay with his superiors in the regime. He would not allow production to cease, nor would he allow me to leave the country to possibly tell the world that his benign regime was in the business of oppression. Sooner or later, Kwang Ki would kill me, and my own father would undoubtedly shrug off my murder as collateral damage. At 3 a.m, I slept from my tent and walked back to the first checkpoint, leaving everything behind save for a duffel bag packed with essential items. I gruffly demanded the scared young man in the soldier's uniforms allow me to pass, and I was convincing enough in my feigned authority that I was ushered through the gate. It was the same as the next gate, but the soldiers waiting for me at the main entrance had their rifles cocked and at the ready. I was detained and made to wait until Bo Kwang Ki arrived, his hair tousled from sleep and a tight expression of carefully controlled rage on his face. He said, "You're not stupid, and neither am I, sir. I suspected you would try to sneak away in the dead of night. I can't let you do that." He put a pistol on my back and started marching me up the road on foot. We had just reached the first inner gate when a high-pitched siren began wailing in the main building, making everyone in earshot jump in unison. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. I had a pretty good idea what the siren might be warning us against. The infection was no longer contained. Bo Kwang Ki barked some orders at the soldiers in their native tongue. They scrambled into tactical positions as another officer ran to fetch the radio. Kwang Ki shoved me back in the direction of the main entrance and snarled, "Wait for me at the front gate. Go!" I ran back and put my hands up, screaming at the guards to hold their fire. From a distance, I could hear a growing cacophony of screams and gunshots. The infection had ripped through the workers on the evening shift and spread to the tent city. I could see staccato bursts of orange and white as gunfire lit up the night beyond the second security fence. The guards standing beside me at the main gate were listening to the panicked voices on their radio with an identical look of glassy-eyed horror. One of them turned to me and gasped, "The camp is gone. They've been forced to retreat." The gunfire continued, as did the screams of despair and agony. The growing wave of the dead overwhelmed the first line of defense and came running to the second gate. I quailed at the sight of the quiet horde beneath the emergency floodlights, now several hundred strong and surging along like a tidal wave. They made no sound as they fell beneath a hail of bullets, unfeeling and uncaring. They clashed into the fence, and it immediately began to buckle before the sheer mass of the bodies pressing into the other side. Someone shouted an order, and the soldiers promptly stopped firing, turning to flee mere seconds before the fence gave out and toppled flat onto the ground. I seized one of the guards by the shirt and bellowed, "They're coming! Open this goddamn gate, you bloody fool! Run for your life!" I shoved the terrified young man into the control booth. He released the locking mechanism, and we all ran through the gate like the wind, all of us sprinting for our lives in opposite directions. Somewhere behind us, the survivors were scrambling to get away from their pursuers, a ravenous horde of silent shadows in the darkness. I ran to the top of a steep incline overlooking the factory and stopped to catch my breath. From my vantage point, I observed that one lone figure reached the gate slightly ahead of the rest of them, only to dash into the control booth and initiate the closing sequence. He scrambled through the rapidly narrowing gap with only a bare instant to spare. Seconds later, there were a multitude of shrill cries from the other side, followed by another burst of gunfire. This was followed by a great volley of hysterical screaming, and when it was all over, the only sound was dead hands battering against the steel bars of the gate. I shall never forget those despairing cries, my friend. Not if I live to be 200 years old. They still haunt my nightmares. I had little doubt this horrible treachery had been carried out by Bo Kwang Ki. He coldly sacrificed the survivors in order to keep the infection contained within the fortified walls. I watched as he examined the ground in the moonlight, looking for footprints in the dirt, and I knew I would have to kill him with great haste, or I would never leave Burma in one piece. Although the administration undoubtedly knew of my presence, only Kwang Ki could have verified that I was still alive. The regime would have to dispatch all the ghouls and sift through their bodies in order to determine if my lifeless corpse was amongst their ranks. I intended to be long gone across the Indian border before this happened. But Bo Kwang Ki needed to die first, and quickly, before reinforcements arrived. I snuck down the hill and crouched behind an outcropping of jagged rocks, watching my nemesis as he followed my blundering tracks across the scrubland, with a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. I scooped up a handful of large pebbles and trickled them down the precipice below, alerting him to my location. Kwang Ki went as still as a statue. He stared in my direction for a moment, then turned off his flashlight and resumed his stealthy stalking in the moonlight. He called out, "You'll never get across the border, you fool. You won't make it 10 miles before you're captured by a patrol. It would be better for you to come out now and surrender peacefully. I promise no harm will come to you." I knew his assurances were lies. Men like Kwang Ki tell lies for a living, after all. I waited until he was near the foot of the rocky slope, then I popped up from my hiding place to hurl down a large rock upon his head. It missed and struck him in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground with a strangled cry of pain. He rolled onto his back and blindly fired his weapon above him, forcing me to dive for cover as bullets ricocheted off the rocks in all directions. "You dog!" he cried out. "You treacherous dog!" "Treachery?" I called back. "You would know all about treachery, wouldn't you, sir?" I made my way to the bottom of the slope and stood over him with another large stone clasped in my hands. Bo Kwang Ki had been grievously injured by the falling rock. His shoulder was hunched at an odd angle, and the arm attached to it lay uselessly beside him. He bared his teeth at me in a grimace of rage and pulled a knife from his sheath on his belt. "I'll cut you," he snarled, and he attempted to slash my legs. I skipped back from harm's way and hurled the heavy stone with all my might. It bounced off his chest with tremendous force. He dropped his knife and spasmed on the ground in agony. "You dog," he whizzed. "Kill you." I wrested one final chunk of stone from the ground and I told him, "You'll never harm another living being, you soulless bastard." I lifted the rock high and dropped it on his head, cutting off his scream with a sickening crunch. I'd never killed a man before, and I was surprised by how little I felt at his passing. I watched Crown Key's body carefully for a minute or two, his pistol clutched in my hand. But he did not come back from the dead. Either he managed to avoid contamination from the noxious chemical byproduct, or I'd destroyed his brain to the point where resurrection was no longer possible. I'll never know for sure, but I can say with confidence that I was a trifle disappointed I did not get a chance to dispatch that horrible man a second time. I'm not ashamed to admit it would have brought me great satisfaction to kill him once again. I robbed his lifeless body of all weapons, ammunition, money, and anything else I deemed to be useful. I headed west under the pale light of the moon. I won't bore you with the details of my escape from Burma, as this tale has certainly dragged on long enough. All I will say is that several more men died by my hand before I crossed into Bangladesh. Regrettable, perhaps, but I'm alive and present to tell the tale. A toast, sir, to my continuing survival in this world of perfidious schemes and damning betrayals. A toast to us all. What was my father's reaction, you ask? He was furious, of course. He threatened to disown me for, in his own words, bungling the deal. I informed him I would gladly sacrifice my inheritance for the privilege of telling him to go to hell, and I reminded him that I owned a large stake in many of our family ventures. He never spoke to me again, the horrible old bastard. It was a state of affairs I found to be most agreeable. When he passed on, I sold my shares to my siblings, and I took early retirement from the world of big business, with at least a portion of my soul still intact. And with that, sir, my tale has reached its conclusion. I don't expect you to believe a single word of it, but I don't expect you to disbelieve it either. There are many wondrous and horrible things in the world, both in it and beyond. I've spent many years in pursuit of the arcane, and I can tell you with great confidence that much strangeness lurks in the shadows of the five senses. Smile and shake your head if you will, but the unwary often find themselves in fantastic situations. Mark my words, good sir, it happens all the time. Good night, old friend, and take care. We share a bottle and an evening of macabre tales again very soon. I look forward to it. I hope you enjoyed The Burmese Incident by T.W. Grimm, as performed by yours truly. If you've enjoyed what you've heard tonight, I'd like to remind you one last time that tonight's featured author can be found by visiting our website. Just visit simplyscarypodcast.com/grim. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/GRIM. Again, for those of you looking to get a grander banquet than the little taste we have tonight, you can venture over to pick up Tripping Over Twilight, a newly published collection of his works available in Kindle format. And remember, you may have to wait until July 21st to get the book itself, but you can pre-order it now and have it delivered on publication day. Thanks again for your support of this show and tonight's featured author. Now, before we go, I'd also like to take a moment to thank you personally for joining me on this episode of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. If you've enjoyed what you've heard on today's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference and would mean a lot to us. If you'd like to hear a premium extended edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes featuring twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can purchase season passes for this podcast and our other quality storytelling programs, or become a patron for as little as $5 a month. and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, all of it ad-free. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. You can subscribe to me on YouTube as well at the Otis Jiry channel, where you'll find releases of my series, Horror Storytime, dating back to 2014. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram too. Just search for Otis Jiry. Stay tuned as the season is just getting started. Until next week, stay spooky and get some sleep, if you can. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.